Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, good morning. So as everyone is settling in, I would like to get started because we have quite an interesting and exciting session planned for this roundtable. So what shall we be discussing this morning? First of all, we're going to have a roundtable on creating a safer and more inclusive online environment. My name is Sanne Thijssen. I am a People versus Big Tech leading our youth programming work. And to be honest, a lot of what we'll be discussing today has been on my mind the past few weeks and months as I've worked along with young people, with experts, and more. And I'm sure a lot of this will also relate to your own jobs and your own backgrounds. So, as we know, currently, the dominant business models of big tech companies contribute to division, commodifying our attention, and raising concerns around around personal data. But we also know that digital platforms can lead to innovation, to connection, and to creativity as well. Still, the challenges that persist disproportionately affect children, they disproportionately affect young people, women, marginalized communities, and so therefore we're looking for solutions that are balanced, sustainable, and that are also very thoughtful. Today, we'll be exploring different key issues such as privacy, consumer protection, addictive design, and safety by design principles as well. We'll also address important debates around smartphone use and smartphone bans for children, age verification, digital security. But I think it's also important to highlight the fact that we're also going to be touching upon how to shift the burden away from individuals and families towards creating safe digital spaces for all. As I dive deep into these complex topics with our amazing panels, key respondents, and of course yourselves, I do want to acknowledge that some of these discussions might actually raise more questions than answers. They might be uncomfortable because people will bring in different perspectives than your own. And so I really encourage everyone to sit with the unknown and maybe also kind of sit with the emotions that this brings up with you and for you as we try to navigate this together. On that note, I am very, very excited to introduce our distinguished panelists. Each of them bring a wealth of insights and experience to the discussion. Caroline Sinders is Executive Director at Convocation Research and Design. Caroline is an award-winning critical designer, researcher, and artist, and they're the founder of human rights and design lab Convocation Research and Design. For the past few years, they have been examining the intersections of artificial intelligence, intersectional justice, harmful design, systems and politics in digital conversational spaces, and technology platforms. They've worked with the Tate Exchange at the Tate Modern, the UN, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, the European Commission, Ars Electrica, the Harvard Kennedy School, and others. We also have with us Diana Vlad-Kalcic. Sorry, I hope I did justice to your name. A member of cabinet of the Vice President of the European Commission, Vera Jourova. Diana advises the Vice President on all things related to democracy and fundamental rights. She's back from a secondment at the US Consumer Protection and Competition Authority, the Federal Trade Commission. I was previously with DG Connect at the European Commission preparing the Digital Service Act. She's been with the Commission since 2011 and has a background in both political science and computer science. Moving on to Yasin. Yasin is a UN youth leader, a UNHCR youth champion, a board member, and an anti-racism panel coordinator at IGLIO, focusing on a wide range of matters such as refugees and migrants' rights, period poverty, sports, digital rights, peace building, anti-racism, and decolonialism, both within the LGBTQIA+ community and beyond. Their experience is derived from diverse lived experiences as an indigenous, migrant person of color, as well as diverse engagements with various local and global organizations such as Let's Talk Period, Cyprus, Women Win, and more. Last but not least, we have Molly. Molly is an online safety advocate who focuses heavily on inclusion, positivity, and the creation of safe spaces. Their experiences with their own mental health and growing up queer highlighted the many issues other young people face online. Currently, as a student at the University of Galway, Molly is studying for their bachelor's in human rights and has brought their expertise in online safety to events like the European Safety Internet Forum, InSafe Training, and the World Economic Forum. So, as I mentioned, we'll be hearing from a very diverse panel and listening to their contributions, as well as, may I add, some of our key respondents who I will be turning the mic to throughout the conversation. I do want to apologize in advance to both our panelists and our key respondents, as well as some of you that might be asking questions, as I will be cutting you short if we're running low on time. And that is not because I don't want to hear what you're saying, but I just want to ensure that we have sufficient time for the rest of the room to feed into the discussion, ask questions, share reflections, before we leave this room at the end of the session. So let's get into it. I want to turn my first question to Yasin. Yasin, you have experience with navigating digital spaces, and you know that these often serve as both a refuge, but also a battleground for diverse communities and identities as well. Considering your role as a UN youth leader, your extensive work as well on refugees and migrants' rights, anti-racism, digital rights, what key challenges do you see impacting those who navigate these digital environments? And also, how do your own lived experiences impact your perspectives on these challenges?
Yeah, thank you. As you mentioned, as you described, my lived experiences are the ones that are leading my work or leading my perspectives. Because even, for example, coming here, on my way here, coming through the airport, because of the new migration pact that was passed by the European Parliament, I was the potential dangerous criminal that was subjected to invasive biometric data collection, police scrutiny, as well as intrusive border control and technologies to protect the EU. But also from another lens, besides the new migration pact, I'm also, from the lens of the community guidelines, I'm a threat to the status quo when voicing out community issues or just casually posting as a queer or a person, for example, calling out or calling in racist or homophobic, transphobic, or anything from that sort that remains being challenged and changed. As a young activist with a lot of intersecting marginalized identities, myself and a lot of people from the communities are standing lost and overwhelmed because it's a crisis where we don't know where to start from. We have, from us as people from the communities, we don't know how to show up in these spaces because they're dominant by a certain category of folks. But also from people getting arrested, for example, for just posting a solidarity post with Gaza, for example, to people, to AI being sexist and racist by design, to shadow banning and data privacy violations, to migration pact that I just mentioned, to trans voices being silenced, or to our posts that we continue sponsoring in order for visibility, yet the algorithm managed to not show them to the communities that we're targeting. We stand lost in front of these issues that are threatening our presence in these digital spaces that are meant to be for us to express ourselves and to even exist for some of us who are at the end of the spectrum of intersectionalities that are marginalized as well. These issues makes us at the same time rightfully so angry because we're not present, but this anger is a healthy anger that can also be translated to an active work and not only compromising for queer-friendly spaces or colorblind platforms, because we no longer want to have queer-friendly, we want to have queer solutions and anti-racist platforms that are directly to the point and working on the matter from its systemic roots. And because obviously for our communities, although we're showing up to the spaces in baby steps, as I mentioned, silence is no longer an option and won't be an option. It will take some time because digital spaces are not something, especially from grassroots, it's not something where we're very present, only to report back to our communities. But we do have the experiences and the expertise to collaborate, let's say, with frontliners who are governmental or not, to work on these matters to make them more, as I mentioned, queer and anti-racist by design and not only friendly for us.
Thank you. I would like to turn my attention to you, Caroline, because I think also a lot of what you do kind of flags some points that Yasin already mentioned. With your background in critical design, intersectional justice, and also the impact of harmful design principles, how do you view the role of designing and shaping users' experiences on digital platforms? And I know also your research touches upon the concept of dark patterns. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on this, and then also how these design practices impact users?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that. Can everyone hear me? Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Design, I often describe, is a translating level between policy and technology, but everything around us is designed. All of you are sitting in chairs and you're at a table. Those are designed objects. You entered in through this building that is designed following specific kinds of codes. So design is sort of shaping a user's experience in the physical world and the digital world. And I believe that design, especially inside of digital products, is as important as the way that the product is built via software. Harmful design patterns are often called dark patterns or deceptive design patterns. They manipulate, confuse, or can impede users' ability to make decisions that they want to make, meaning the design can sort of move them towards a decision they did not intend to make. A European Commission report found that vulnerable consumers were more likely to make inconsistent choices than average consumers when exposed to harmful design patterns / dark patterns. But they also found that if a user already knew what a dark pattern was or had a background in user experience, that they were more likely to be able to identify that dark pattern. That means that, in essence, we're already in a very asymmetrical web. But more importantly, one of the things I really like to sort of emphasize is that even as an expert in harmful design patterns, I often fall victim to harmful design patterns. And in fact, all of you in this room do. How many of you have to click through very confusing cookie banners or have booked a plane ticket on Ryanair? You have already been exposed to that. In some cases, if you've subscribed to, let's say, a kind of service and you've decided to unsubscribe, but you're still getting notifications, you're still being charged, that's also a harmful design pattern. So these are different kinds of design patterns that are not only impacting consumers financially, it's also impacting consumers' privacy. Different academic researchers, such as Arnesh Mathur at Princeton University, has found that there's also this extra level of which we call the cognitive burden of dark patterns or harmful design patterns, because they're making it so much more difficult and confusing to navigate the web. Now, a harmful design pattern is taking an established design pattern. A design pattern is like a library that's built out of usability studies and best practices over many years. The way I like to liken it to is, as you, let's say, walk up a set of stairs, you're getting used to like the how tall each step is, right? So you know where to place your feet. Imagine if one step is 2 inches shorter or like 5 centimeters shorter, you will trip. That is a sort of wobbly example of what I'm trying to go for, but a design pattern sort of allows us to use the web in a very sort of sustainable way. It's why you can use software, let's say, built in Croatia, and you can be based in the Netherlands, right? Those developers and designers are following, in a way, guidelines, if not standards. But a harmful design pattern looks at the standard and often is subverting it. That can be adding an extra step. That can be the emphasis of a much larger button that has a color, sort of throwing back to that cookie banner example. So what this is doing is it's making it, again, incredibly difficult to navigate the web, but also it is harming vulnerable consumers. Those might be folks that are older consumers navigating the web in a second, third, or fourth language. Those that might have any kind of disability or have accessibility needs, but again, also are harming regular consumers. So I think it's a very pertinent area to discuss when we talk about web equity and digital rights. I also think I mean, they're prevalent across so many different kinds of websites, not just e-commerce-based websites, but there are also harmful design patterns sort of rooted in different kinds of social media platforms that we can get into later in this panel. I don't want to take up too much time.
We'll definitely have a bit more time to work through a bit of that. Thank you. Molly, as an advocate for online safety and inclusion, you obviously see some of these design choices as well, but what are the choices that you see that are addictive or inclusive, and how do they impact the experiences of diverse groups? Considering also your personal experiences, but also your studies in human rights, what insights can you share about the importance about creating accessible and supportive environments for young people?
Yes, I think the last part, talking about creating accessible environments for young people, is really important. I'm going to talk a lot about just my personal experience online, because that's something that obviously I think can work more so for me. So I'm neurodivergent, so I have dyslexia and I have ADHD. Going on the online world can be a really hard experience for me, and it definitely takes down the choice that I have. When I pick an app, I have to make sure that the app is inclusive for me. Like, a lot of apps won't have audio versions for text, things like that, and I really struggle with reading. And so that automatically takes down which amount I can use. And then also I'm queer, so I look specifically for apps that are more queer friendly and have pronouns in the bios and things like that. Without that, as a non-binary person, I don't feel comfortable using an app. So there's two things already that puts me down from what apps I choose. And then when I do choose an app, a lot of the time I don't actually get to think about the harassment or the policies in these apps. First of all, the reason I don't get to think about that is because on average it can take 5.5 hours sometimes to read a policy. Now, as a person with dyslexia, where these policies aren't offered in an audiobook version, that is not accessible for me. And it's not accessible to a lot of people in the world, even people that are just working day-to-day jobs that don't have the time to do that. So that is one thing that makes it not accessible. And then there's also the emphasizes, I also have a seizure disorder. And not many apps think about this. So many apps out there do not have flashing light warnings when you're going to watch a video or something. Some do, and sometimes they don't actually realize the severity of how simple a flashing light can be. So they might not deem it as a big issue, but for me it can be. And I've been watching screens on my phone sometimes, and I've been put into a seizure. And that's not something that's talked about a lot, because not everybody is affected about it, but some people are. And they're kind of things that I think about when I think about the design choice and choosing an app, because things that other people might choose an app are very different to me, but the ones that I choose are unique to me in ways, especially when it comes to the seizure things, and also the long policies, which I think it affects a lot more things. So they're kind of things that I find young people look into, and they look into making sure that they feel included in the app and make sure that the app represents them as a person. But because of that, we are lead to choosing apps that don't represent us, because we might pick the things that actually that our needs need, like me, like I physically need to make sure an app isn't going to flash a light at me. But that means me leaving the part that I might not be fully protected on the app, which leads to my other things, because I speak out on a lot of issues. I've been doxxed, my parents have received death threats about me, tell me how they've raised me in a terrible way. And unfortunately, I'm left to not really be able to deal with that, because of the fact that I had to choose going on one of these apps because they were the only ones that I could physically be able to be on. And I think that's then obviously leaving to effect on my mental well-being and other people's effect on their mental well-beings. But because of the lack of choice and the lack of inclusivity in these apps, we don't really have a choice. We just have to learn to deal with it and face the consequences of speaking out on actions that we should be allowed to do. And I think that's kind of why I emphasize making apps inclusive.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Molly. I think it also speaks to a number of different issues, and kind of brings together how just one person can experience such an array of impacts, and why it's so important that we really have platforms that are inclusive. Diana, given your experience advising the Vice President of the European Commission on both digital democracy and fundamental rights, What are your current thoughts on the current state of the Digital Service Act, particularly regarding the protections of minors from addictive design practices, and also what kind of gaps have you identified?
Thank you so much, and thank you for allowing me to speak last, because it's been extremely enriching to listen to your perspectives, and I've been taking notes, and I'll try to link it a little bit to the answer to the question. So from my perspective, advisor to Vice President Vera Jourova, I would say that this is definitely one topic that she's particularly interested in. We're just back from Canada, where the same type of conversation happened in other rooms with a similarly diverse group of people in different interests and different, I would say, roles in finding solutions. And I can see this happening elsewhere in the world as well, the same conversation that we're having here. Now, in Europe, what we do have is that we're one step ahead in terms of having legal solutions, and you've mentioned the Digital Services Act that I am particularly and personally attached to, having written some of the first versions of the provisions that we're discussing today. But the other point is that this is also a point of responsibility for Europe, because we're in a stage where we're enforcing the rules. So now we're finding the practical solutions. And this is part of the gaps analysis. Maybe we have principles in the law, we have to see them, to bring them to life and to translate them into what it actually means in practical terms. And if I can take 1 minute just to talk about the development of the Digital Services Act, I mean, the first point of conversation initially when we were about to propose the law was really about illegal content and exposure to children to maybe harmful content to them, which might not be legal by law, but certainly it was that almost safety security angle. And clearly one of the first objectives was to open spaces for conversation rather than foreclose them by exposure to violence and harmful aspects. And I think this was already mentioned as one of the issues. But this is an area where we've realized quite abruptly over the past few years that we need to go much broader, and design and addictive design is definitely one of the key aspects here. And I won't start telling you what the law says, but what I will say is that we were keeping in mind two types of principles maybe, and one is that solutions are not one size fits all, just like addictive design doesn't hit everyone in the same way, so that is one element of attention. And maybe the second one I just wanted to raise was that we were looking at avoiding sort of patronizing approaches where you'd say, no, the sort of generational gap, we know best, so let's take away your phones, or let's tell you what to do. It's more about empowerment, and we're seeking solutions to empower young users, children, but not only. I think there are other vulnerable categories, and it's important to speak about it as well. And I just don't want to be the first one who gets cut on the mic, but I will say that I am looking now from a little bit of a distance in awe to the work that colleagues enforcing the Digital Services Act are doing, with a call for evidence that has just closed, and I hear that, I think it closed last night maybe, and it's in the margins of hundreds of replies that we've received, and that's a commitment to continue this conversation based on the evolving evidence, and I think we'll get back to that later on. But they're working hard on providing guidelines, on bringing these rules to life. So I wouldn't speak in terms of gaps per se now, but I would speak in terms of this is a thinking and a practical solution space that needs to evolve, and we need to have the conversations and the science behind it to understand how this evolves. I have a couple more points, but I'll save them for the conversation as it develops. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, because I think what we're hearing now is that there are a number of different challenges that we're trying to navigate, and so I'd like to give a little bit of space, again, a little bit of space, because I really do want to move on to looking at like different solutions and really seeing how can we, with all the expertise and wealth of knowledge here in this room today, like what are steps that we can come up with together in terms of taking the conversation forward after the session. But I think also I want to go back to you, Molly, in terms of like you also mentioned some of these different challenges, and I'm very curious to hear from your perspective, where do you see the biggest challenges and potentially already like looking forward at potential solutions when it comes to creating these safer digital environments, and then particularly when it comes to your mental health and your well-being. I'm just very curious to hear your reflections on that. Very briefly, please.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, when you talk about challenges, you mentioned it there a minute ago, addictive design. I think that's a big thing. I have ADHD. I spoke a bit about that briefly earlier, not too much, but I find that sometimes with apps, with addictive design, it can take advantage of people, neurodiverse people, and people that might be more vulnerable to this addictive design, because our brains are in a way that it's just not the same as a neurotypical brain, but also people with young people as well that have been raised in, like, if you're starting technology from the age of like really young, 3 to 4, like, or something like that, your brain can be built into this addictiveness as well. I just wanted to emphasize that, because I think when we talk about addictive design, we forget how it impacts everybody differently and not the same, and that there are people more vulnerable to it than others. I think when we talk about the solutions, I think it's important to talk about the fact that we can't solve a problem till we talk about it. And I find that's a big issue, that we're not talking about these issues. With platforms, I find sometimes they can get just defensive about the issue, rather like straight away trying to defend, and rather to admit that there might be a problem. And it's okay to admit that there's a problem with something, because that's the only way that we can work together and fix it, if we admit that there's something wrong, and together we can talk about it. Like, I feel like that's an issue that comes with, when it comes to the solutions, a lot of time when, like for myself, when I speak up on an issue, I don't come from it from a place of hate and wanting to be like, you're wrong and I'm right. It's more so in a way as, the reason I say that this problem is there is because it affects so many people, and I want to do it in a way of empathy and being able to have conversations and talk together to try and solve it, and not create this barrier between us. And that's something I really want to emphasize. But then with one more thing on solutions, I think about more accessible policies. All policies should have an audiobook version. I'm very strong on that, because it's just not fair. And then obviously there needs to be more youth-friendly versions of these policies, and also for adults as well, and for people with disabilities.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I hear you, and I think that also kind of builds on ensuring that there's spaces that people can actually understand what is being said, which also kind of brings me to you, Yassine, as well, because you also mentioned something around like the erasure of marginalized identities within digital spaces, right? What actions do you feel are important to ensure that these diverse voices are also heard and they're also protected? And it also links again towards what you were saying, Molly, around like safer spaces, a place where you feel welcome when you're using these platforms. So yeah, to you, Yassine, what are the key challenges in creating an inclusive and as you mentioned, anti-racist online environment? And what do you feel are steps that can be taken?
Yeah, so briefly, the key challenges, as I mentioned, but also as Molly touched on, from digital oppression and harassment to shadow banning and online censorship, as well erasure of marginalized identities, as I mentioned, and given a specific example of binary thinking in a lot of these platforms that is still there, like male versus female. Moreover, the AI being sexist and racist by design, as I mentioned earlier, and there is a great article by Bloomberg, Technology and Equality, article titled as Humans Are Biased, Generative AI is Worse. Alongside the impact on marginalized groups. For example, myself, let's say when I'm a migrant who lived in Cyprus, and I was scared to go get a basic blood test, because I know if I tested HIV positive, I wouldn't be the first one who will know that, but the government will know first, and I might be subjected to deportation. So I wouldn't know that first. And going back to the key solutions for me, I would like to take back one of a friend of mine, but also a data and AI policy expert said, the systems we design inherit the very structures they arise from. When gender neutral and colorblind systems encounter patriarchal and racist structures, they inevitably become systems that are patriarchal and racist by design. This is a crucial reminder that this conversation is beyond digits and bytes, but it's mostly about people and about communities that are real. And in order to dismantle these systems, these patriarchal and racist foundations, we need to we need to move on from the same old tools. We need to get people involved that are not the same predominant demographic that is white, middle-aged, heterosexual men with limited understanding of local realities and dangers faced in other regions in the world to continue coding algorithms, crafting policies, and governing our data. We should embrace more the nothing for us without us, not only by saying, but by acting on it. Last 2 points, I promise. Frontline public institutions and major tech companies must do more than just engage in token gestures. It must be non-negotiable that decision-making processes and the creation of inclusive digital spaces includes LGBTQI people, other marginalized communities, and individuals with diverse lived experiences on an individual level. And the work that we do and you do, there should be a duty to amplify the efforts and voice the voice of these groups. These goes beyond panel conversations, youth assemblies, task forces, or advisory panels. It requires reimagining power structure, as you mentioned, and ensuring no one is left behind, meaning that youth leaders, specifically from marginalized communities, needs to have a seat at the main table, not at the kids' table, and being part of the creating process all the way, and just embracing more the true co-conspiratorship than just the whitewashy, pinkwashed, race-washed, greenwashed, and all of you want from allyship, because that's very performative, and we need to go beyond that.
Yeah, so structural changes are needed instead of placating these issues. I would like to take a moment to redirect the attention from our amazing panel and bring in some other voices in the room, because I'd like to turn our attention to Lisa. So Lisa, get yourself set up. So one thing that's already been discussed today is the impact of addictive design, and I know that Amnesty has published research specifically touching upon this, but I'd be curious to hear, what are the key findings and which recommendations have followed that you might or might not feel have already been echoed here today?
Thanks so much for all that, and thanks to our panelists for sharing very personal experiences as well. And I think it's really key to listen more to young people, to their own voices. That was a key part of our year-long project at Amnesty Tech, looking into TikTok. First of all, why did we look into TikTok? This is not just about one platform. TikTok is very much leading the charge right now in terms of building the magic source that keeps kids online. They are quite open about this. I was shocked to read that actually TikTok quite openly markets the fact that it is proud to displace other hobbies, other uses of young people's time. It openly says, we're proud to say Gen Z spends less time listening to podcasts and more time on TikTok. So this is very much part of their core business model, and that's something that I think needs to be addressed a bit more. Yassine said it's baked into the system. Yes, it's baked into the business model, and in fact, other social media platforms are desperately trying to learn from TikTok, to learn about the very thing that we defined as very real human rights harms. We spoke to young people. We looked at the TikTok For You feed, the core experience that billions of young people right now spend hours of their days on, and we looked specifically at what it means to be a young person with vulnerabilities, because if we think about human rights respecting models, indeed these apps need to function for those who are most vulnerable to be impacted by the negative outcomes. What does that concretely mean, jargon-free? We looked at how quickly a young person, a 13-year-old who might be interested in mental health, who might have mental health issues themselves, who might be going through very difficult times, and that is true for most young people at one stage in their teenagehood. You'll probably remember for yourselves that there were times that were difficult, and right now it's TikTok that a lot of young people turn to express their own feelings, to learn about how other people are coping. And what they find on there isn't professional advice. What they find on there within 20 minutes of signing up and showing some kind of interest in mental health is content that actively promotes, romanticizes, encourages self-harm, depression, even suicide. It didn't take us long to get into these rabbit holes. And I can only imagine what it does to young people. We spoke to young people who were suffering from a variety of mental health issues, and they described to us in really blatant terms what it means to be dragged into a dark hole on a daily basis. They struggle to get out of it, and TikTok actively keeps them in there. Every time they open the app, even if they use all those magical tools that TikTok advertises as self-help solutions, essentially, they found actually the algorithm is very much trained to keep on finding the stuff that keeps them engaged. And for a young person suffering from anxiety, suffering from depression, that means sad content, that means emotional, dramatic content that is very much there to drag them into a black hole. It literally is a different visual language that is meant to manipulate. It's a manipulation machine that TikTok is aware of. We weren't the first to prove this. We're one in a very, very long line of research teams to look into this. And we know that other platforms are just as aware of these core issues. And as we say, it's systemic. It is by default, and they know this. And we're curious to see whether the Digital Services Act and the many ongoing investigations are going to lead to real change. That, as you say, many people in this room have put hard work into developing something that is quite progressive, whether that's good enough to really deal with the addictive impact as well, to deal with the mental health issues we'll see in the enforcement. We're a bit wary of being too optimistic at this stage. Indeed, for good reasons, we're having conversations around further legislation to deal with many of the privacy issues that continue to drag people into this kind of system. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you for these insights. Yeah, and it's actually wild if you think about it, and that TikTok is actively promoting that they're taking away young people's time from other things that could also benefit them. Let's put it that way. So Caroline, back to you, because I know you started to explain something really, really interested in, and I really wanted to give you more time, but here we are. I would be very curious to hear also around kind of your perspectives on like what you were sharing around these dark patterns, but also like how they impact at the individual level, how they impact people's agency, how they impact people's privacy, their ability to navigate these digital spaces. Like, what are the key concerns there? But then also kind of touching upon what was already shared around the DSA, the Digital Service Act, which key concerns arise there?
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for this. I mean, one of the things I want to say, also sort of building upon Lisa's points, is, when we think of this sort of like this baked into platforms, I think we see this also a lot with harmful design patterns, that there's often an economic incentive for companies to trick consumers. At times, we can see this with cookie banners that nudge users to give up more privacy protecting decisions, to things, again, like I mentioned earlier, subscription traps, where that cause users to overspend, right? Being upsold things. One of the things I've noticed in my different kinds of investigation work is, not all the time, but often if there is one harmful design present, there's often another. So it's not necessarily happening in isolation, but there's multiple things inside of a product that are sort of contributing and amplifying the harm. So a consumer might say, like, I'm just going to throw out a random example, Ryanair. You on one page, you might be like, yes, I missed the upsell for this seat, but then on the next page, you might accidentally click on something thinking you need to pay for, let's say a certain like luggage piece without realizing it. So a consumer might miss or avoid one kind of harm in the entire sort of user flow, but still be susceptible to these other harms and still fall for them. And one of the things I want to say is that this is not the fault of the user or the consumer. This is something that is the fault of the product or software. We should not be building a web in which users have to become experts of design. More importantly, I want to build on some of Molly's points. I'm also a neurodiverse person. I have ADHD. Confusing, overwhelming, and friction-filled experiences impact consumers differently, most likely impacting neurodiverse consumers as well. placing a call out here, someone please do a study on harmful design patterns specifically focusing on neurodiverse consumers. To my knowledge, there has not been one specifically focused on that user group. But also going back to platforms and addicting design, I also want to talk about the general lack of support we see for things like online harassment, online gender-based violence that I think is also a part of this conversation. Lisa touched on tools that, let's say, that have been sort of, they've like looked at and maybe tested on TikTok. Generally, what I found, having spent a decade studying online gender-based violence, is there's a general lack of support we see for folks facing that kind of violence. The tools that do exist, there are not many. They are often difficult to find. Generally also, so I not only study online gender-based violence, I also provide security support for folks impacted by those harms. So often when people are facing different kinds of digital violence, it's very overwhelming. They're in a space of panic and trauma. It is very difficult to access tools generally. Suddenly, let's say, again, random example, let's take Facebook. If you're trying to access different kinds of helplines or change your settings, let's say security settings, because the default settings, which is also a form of dark patterns in different academic papers, have users on less privacy protecting settings, right? This does expose folks facing online harassment to more harassment. What we have found is often consumers do not realize how much they've exposed their own digital lives and also their personal lives. So if anyone is facing things, let's say like persistent digital stalking, they've inadvertently created almost a map of their habits. That is not, again, the fault of the consumer. They are using the product as intended, which is, again, a form of harm. So all of these things, I think, are compounding when we start to talk about what are different forms of harm. Harmful design / dark patterns is one area. Addicting design is another. Online gender-based violence and how software is explicitly culpable in sort of furthering that harm. All of these are, I think, under this umbrella topic of broken design. But again, design is becoming that sort of interface or space where a consumer is trying to reach safety. And so design is then, again, as I have said earlier, really impeding them from that. And, in terms of the DSA, I live in London. So we do not have that, but I work with different organizations in the EU. One of the things that I am very excited about is the fact that online harms, like such as dark patterns, while not necessarily particularly defined by name, are at least defined in Recital 67, right, as online interfaces of platforms that are practices that materially distort or impair, so on. So I'm not going to read it to you, but this is, I think, a very good beginning of a definition. It's one that, as a dark patterns expert, speaks to what that is. I'm excited to see it implemented. One of the things I've been doing in the UK, I just finished up a 2-year fellowship with the ICO, has been looking at how do we extend the current laws inside of the United Kingdom, trying to combat dark patterns. So one of the things we've been doing is looking at GDPR. I co-wrote a paper with the ICO and the CMA on looking at what we call harmful design patterns and online choice architecture. One of the things we found, just as a very brief example, then I will yield my time, is let's say looking at you're setting up a new profile on a big tech platform. There is like a fast way, which is 2 steps, and a longer way, which is multiple steps. In our paper, we found this to be a harmful nudge, or what we call the sludge, which creates asymmetric friction between these 2 choices that's often encouraging the user towards the shorter steps. That, however, is like the less privacy protecting one, but also those detailed settings are what is explaining more what you are agreeing to. The shorter settings we found are potentially likely to infringe on the fairness and transparency principles of UK GDPR. So this is just one example in which, if you look at it just sort of very simply, you're like, oh, well, the faster one is designed for just consumers to more quickly go through, and yet something that is so innocuous as that actually is sort of misrepresenting potentially what users are agreeing to, but more importantly, impeding these specific principles. This is just one example, very UK focused, but there are many more here in the EU that would fall under that, and hopefully things that we can explore more and really sort of use the DSA to combat these harmful design patterns.
Okay. Oh, very insightful. With every response, I feel like we should have more time. It should be a session on its own. Because I want to go again to you, Diana, when, again, back to the DSA and also curious to hear just very briefly, maybe some additional concerns that you've identified when it relates also in your role advising, which key concerns are you raising?
So maybe I'm going to transform a little bit my answer because I want to take the cue on TikTok and the discussion from before. I mean, in terms of the concerns, most of the keywords have been spoken at this table. Of course, we're looking at addictive design and what this means. We're looking at, as I was saying before, sort of opening spaces for discussion. I really wrote down in capital letters, silence is not an option, and I think that this applies to everyone, to children as well, to teens, to a diversity of groups, and it's definitely one of the points that we keep in mind. But on the DSA and the concerns and how it addresses, I'm very proud, in a sense, of the fact that we have a first ever decision. So obviously, we're starting, I wouldn't say slowly, because this has been quite a fast track, but we already have results. And that was the TikTok Lite feature, where they've made a commitment not to actually offer that feature on the suspicion from the Commission that it was highly addictive. So, I mean, you might know the story. This was an experiment launched in France and in Spain, where users were essentially incentivized to stay online by getting reward points that they could convert even in Amazon vouchers. And while these types of decisions are not an admittance of guilt per se, but they do, this is discontinued, and TikTok made a commitment never to offer such a service in Europe again. So that is an interesting point of how a platform has already reacted to the pressure that comes from the regulator. And I think we're looking at evolving issues as well on the type of design. And I've mentioned before the guidelines or the consultation on evidence by my colleagues, and also preparing guidelines. So that's where we're going to try to list the types of issues that we see, but also to provide some sort of support in what are the potential solutions. And one of the points that I find particularly interesting is that the work on these guidelines and the preparation in and of itself includes voices from different parts of society, including from youth. I'm slightly jealous for those conversations with teens and children who are directly impacted by these points. But I want to leave you with two more things, because of course we know this is not the end, and I think the DSA is an important tool, but we know that it is a tool that addresses online platforms. That's the major part of the issue, it's probably not the only part of the issue. So you would have seen, not for my work now, but then for the future commission, that there are maybe two initiatives that is good to keep in mind, because they will host conversations about these aspects. One is a sort of a EU-wide inquiry on the broader impacts of social media and addictive design practices. So this is something that will happen in the next mandate. And then the second point is that we've been discussing from the perspective of DSA and platforms, but through my experience at the Federal Trade Commission, I'm going to say that consumer protection is also an angle. And I want to give a shout out to Egelin Brown, my colleague who's sitting there, who's actually working on the fitness check for consumer protection aspects on digital fairness. I think that there are maybe two announcements for this week on our side. It is very possible that you might read something about this very soon. And the second is a workshop on the DSA that's going to happen at the end of the week. And also the other point that probably Egelin will be working hard on is the forthcoming Digital Fairness Act that was also announced as one potentially further legislation that should cover these aspects from a consumer protection angle. So the concerns are here and we know them, but the processes are also in place to have deeper conversations about solutions.
Thank you. That's definitely where we're going to be heading into looking at the different potential solutions as well. I again want to bring in one of our key respondents, Luce. I'm very curious to hear from your perspectives working at Bits of Freedom. What do you feel are, like, having heard all of this and maybe not, what are additional challenges that you feel deserve our attention while we're in this room together?
So something I've been thinking about is we've been working so hard on the DSA and we've had so many great results. One of them being very large online platforms having to have a non-recommended feed, which is great because, as Lisa already mentioned, the recommender systems on big platforms are very harmful. But then Meta introduced this non-recommended, non-profiling feed as a chronological feed, which is great. But the default setting is still the profiling feed. So every time you open Instagram, you have to switch to the non-profiling feed again, which I feel like is super weird and doesn't really work. It's not really meeting our expectations, and this is something we've been working on with Caroline because we feel like it's so unfair. And this made me think, so a couple weeks ago I went to a casino and this was filled with harmful design, like offline harmful design, all of the colors, the lights, the fake money. Everything was designed for me to spend money and lose money, and I did. And, and it made me think of these very large online platforms. Like, the business model of these platforms is for us to stay on there as long as possible and to earn as much money as possible from us. So we are trying to change stuff within the casino or within the platform, while the business model is still very, very harmful. So sometimes I'm just wondering how we can fix the system and not just the symptoms, because I feel like we've been, with the DSA, we've been staring on these symptoms and we've been creating regulation based on the platforms that are already here and that are already super harmful, which sometimes feels kind of like a response to very harmful stuff instead of changing the entire system of gambling or of being on these online platforms.
And just, I want to add one quick point. Lotte gave a really great example of casinos. If you're interested in like the history of addicting design in physical spaces, casinos and malls are actually designed to not only keep you in them, but to either push you to specific places inside of those physical areas. Casinos in particular are I think, a canonical example because they're designed for the consumer to lose all sense of time. That's why there are no windows and these very specific design points Lotte has brought up. And I also agree, like, I think we almost need to step back and look at things like social media and look at it holistically, maybe similar to a casino versus, you know, if you're fixing a casino, you wouldn't go in and say, we're gonna fix this one slot machine.
Yeah, it's like, sorry to respond. Because like the stairs in the casino in Amsterdam are so uncomfortable that once you get up, you don't want to go down again. And I feel like that's so similar to like TikTok or Instagram, which I've been addicted to all of those. Once you're on it, it's like you get sucked into it, and maybe there's no physical stairs, but there's definitely like digital stairs there.
Yeah, actually, maybe this is a good time to turn back to you, Caroline, because you also mentioned these dark patterns, and you also elaborated about stairs, right? And how it can always feel like there's like you took the analogy of a step that's just a little too low or a little too small. But I'd also just be curious to hear your thoughts around solutions. Like, what steps do we need to encourage ethical design?
That's a really, really great question. I don't think that there's an easy answer. Sometimes the solutions I've seen that get thrown out are like, if we just educate designers, which I think is like one small like drop in a large bucket of solutions we need. I think part of this like is educating designers, but I think it's also educating policymakers around what is design, like what are harmful design patterns, how design is impacting consumer safety. I think that also is education, even though I don't know if this would totally work. I'm very skeptical of it, like educating those inside of big tech, both on the policy team and the design team of how policy works. But I think a lot of it is also doing a lot of concerted collaboration and reach out to consumers. So a big issue is that consumers can be aware that they are, let's say, deceived or manipulated, but what do they do with that and who do they turn to, right? Who is the regulator in their country? And which regulator do they go to? Do they go to a competition and markets authority? Do they go to the privacy commissioner? Do they go to, let's say in the UK, something like Ofcom, right? Who do they go to when they're facing that kind of harm is actually very unclear on the consumer side. And then additionally, how do you describe the harm in a way that a regulator can sort of make next steps on? And then I think an additional issue that we found, to sort of speak sort of very, very candidly, this was one of the most interesting things about working at the ICO, was we had to internally make a series of heuristic questions to prep our investigations team to understand how to look at something and know that they were looking at a harmful design pattern or a dark pattern. So that meant taking like UX heuristics and translating it to specifically the regulator. Knowing that, like, I was on a team that was a lot of designers, the tech innovation strategy team. Not a lot of regulators hire designers. Perhaps we should. Perhaps we should hire design researchers. But we had to take our knowledge knowing that we could not work on every investigation and try to scale it up within the regulator. So I think these are some of the much bigger issues, right? How do you take the specific knowledge? I've worked on different specific court cases in the United States with like local FTC offices and different district attorneys, and also an issue is trying to evidence and create evidence that we think will hold up in a court of law using design. Design has a lot of guidelines that are not necessarily considered hard standards, so it can be at times almost difficult. You have to look at everything almost on a case-by-case basis and look at the individual case itself to then try to isolate or pull out these examples. I also, that's what's been really amazing collaborating with Bits of Freedom, is they very much understand design, but then also the ways in which we're able to look at different things within the DSA, it has made it easier, I think, with some of the research I've been doing, to try to argue this is a harmful design pattern.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's quite some solid solutions there that you've actually put forward that are really worth considering taking forward. Diana, I got you. We're looking at each other already. So yeah, obviously with the DSA, which has already been mentioned, and particularly when it comes to different groups such as young people or other marginalized communities, how do you feel like we can really take things forward and move things forward in a positive way outside of what you've already mentioned, but perhaps also identifying which collaborative strategies are needed in order to identify some of these gaps outside of what we're currently doing?
No, thank you for that question, and I know that we're slowly going towards the end, so maybe one of the points is that we've been discussing it without focusing it so much on it, because we're looking at the Online and Digital Services Act and design of platforms, but I think it's interesting and important to actually go beyond the scope and try to understand that this, I mean, some of the harms that we see, this was voiced by everyone on this panel, they're amplified by specific conditions potentially of the individual who is exposed, and we know that we are looking at loneliness, at mental health issues as well, and these are just maybe the acute elements there. So it's important to recognize them. And I think that once we recognize these aspects, we can also look at the solutions in a more holistic way. It's certainly extremely important to look at design patterns on online platforms, and we've been discussing it for an hour, but it comes in a context. And I think that here we also identify specific roles for parents, families, educators, institutions, and their ability to communicate clearly on what we're doing and what is actually positive around in the world. And certainly more holistically putting in place policies that try to fix issues that the youth are particularly concerned about. And I didn't want to leave this panel without voicing these elements, which are, I think, important to frame our work. The other point of framing is maybe that we've been discussing about what's wrong, where harms happen. But there's a lot that's actually very good. And I think just in terms of my relatively limited review of the literature, there's not a lot of research that's looking at what is good in the interactions that youth have on online platforms. And there are aspects of finding communities, socializing, learnings. Let's not throw away the baby with the bathwater and then think that everything is so gloomy, because I don't think it is. But where there are problems, they are acute and they are urgent. So that's maybe a framing for the type of collaborative strategies across disciplines and across policy areas as well. And maybe the last point, and again, I'm not being comprehensive here, I'm just picking some bits and pieces that we have not spoken about, is that in my favorite legislation so far, in the Digital Services Act, there are other measures than those that try to fix issues directly. So the risk management obligations on platforms saying, thou shall design your platform by protecting children, their fundamental rights, freedom of expression, and so on. There are those elements that I think some call it the transparency machine, but my sense, even in listening to what was said now, is that the transparency machine is starting to work, because you're looking at recommender systems and the type of transparency that was pushed there on platforms, the fact of offering options. And so research and observation from outside of the platform, I think that that's one of the elements that we haven't discussed a lot. There's another measure in the Digital Services Act which is even more intrusive and incentivizes independent research, scientific research into the in-depths of how online platforms work. I'm very interested and curious in seeing tomorrow and a year and then maybe 2 years from now what type of body of research that will give us. And we know that in this space, longitudinal type of studies and more in-depth type of studies, looking at specific design practices, all of these things will bring a richness, I think, of details that will help us make better rules or better enforcement decisions. Then that's another point of cooperation. But a little bit of advertising, because I've been talking about what the European Commission is doing, and then certainly it's a broader invitation to keep the collaboration for now, and I think it's an interesting point in time and also in the political mandate. For now, we're discussing solutions, we're discussing the spectrum of issues as well, through the type of consultations that I've mentioned, guidelines on the Digital Services Act, but also keep tuned for the new college that will be announcing a calendar and of course the way that we generally structure policies. So more to continue, and thank you so much for today.
I'm excited to hear the positive outlook and the kind of the curiosity for what the future will hold, outside of focusing on the problems, but really looking at the solutions that you bring forward. And so we've already had a wealth of insights so far, but I also think it's a great time for us to welcome Dora David from the EPP group to share some reflections, because Dora, I'd be very curious to hear from your end, which steps do you feel must be taken for us to be able to move forward positively?
Thank you. Allow me to briefly introduce myself for those I haven't met yet. I'm a new MEP from Hungary, representing a newly emerged democratic opposition party called TISA, which emerged out of outrage at a state-tolerated child abuse scandal. So, as you can imagine, protection of children, including in the online space, is close to my heart. And so I'm delighted to be invited to participate and to learn from you all, and thank you for your insightful comments. In terms of how we move forward constructively, as a legislator, particularly as a new MEP, I think it's worth understanding what measures and tools have been used so far to tackle these issues. We've talked a lot about these, how effective they've been, and what other tools and measures we might need in addition to address potential risks and harms. So as Lisa, I'll also use the example of TikTok because I think it's a good example to see different approaches to using existing legislation to tackle similar issues, because, as we know, TikTok has faced regulatory investigations in multiple jurisdictions for similar concerns. Common concerns and themes have included opaque information about key features of the service and information about data collection and processing, and including in some cases collection and use of data of minors without information and parental consent. Notably, the FTC fined TikTok in 2019 for this, and in August reopened an investigation, or sued the company again for similar reasons. Another concern is how easy it is to bypass registration requirements for minors. And responses to these concerns have included a variety of responses, from full and partial bans of the app to fines, but more importantly, to voluntary behavioral commitments that have somewhat been effective in changing company behavior. And these investigations in the EU predate the DSA, so as we've talked about the importance of consumer and privacy legislation, that's what they use to tackle these issues. Now we have the DSA as well, and we're pleased to see action, and actually, Diana, thank you for helping me cut my speech short because I was going to talk about TikTok Lite. So although the investigation is still ongoing, we see the impact of it already. So I brought up TikTok because we already see the power of existing laws in changing company behavior, particularly in the case of voluntary commitments. But we know that further action is likely needed, as we heard from the panel today. And so the European Parliament has been asking the Commission to put forward proposals on tackling addictive design, and we're pleased to see that the Commission has been responsive, as we've heard from Diana, and President von der Leyen's political guidelines, as well as the Commissioner-designate's mission letters. But in looking for an effective response, we also need tools that allow us to respond fast, because we know that this is a fast-moving environment where user habits and behavior can change radically and fast over the course of lengthy investigations and legislative consultation. So we don't want to pass legislation that becomes obsolete as soon as we've passed it. So we must bear this in mind. And aside from regulation and effective enforcement, let's not forget the importance of raising awareness, kids and families' awareness about conscious use of these platforms, perhaps through more creative means. As Molly, you've suggested, we have all these policies that are difficult to understand and no one has time. And the Hungarian Competition Authority, for example, elicited voluntary commitments from TikTok to make their to improve their communication about their services, including use of TikTok videos to explain how these work. And I think civil society can be especially of big help in this awareness-raising effort. And finally, I think platforms themselves must be part of an effective response strategy. They should prioritize self-regulation to a certain extent to prevent and address the social consequences that we've all heard about today of the clearly harmful elements of the services and their operating model. And to be honest, I think this really should be in their interest as well, in favor, to ensure that they have a long-term sustainable business model. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very comprehensive and very interesting to hear. I would actually like to bring the conversation to you, Molly, because also you also spoke around platforms and the role that they can play in being more inclusive, but outside of that, also more collaborative approaches as well to ensuring that different voices are heard but also valued in digital spaces. Very briefly, would you be able to elaborate a little bit more around your thoughts and reflections in terms of solutions?
Yeah, of course. So I think the main word that you said there that needs to be talked more about is collaborativeness. I find a lot, and I'm sure a lot of you find this as well, that sometimes that the people aren't talking to the people that are actually being faced by the issue, and it's more so they're being talked about, which I think is hard because I've sat in many rooms over the time where I hear someone talk about neurodiversity and what we're going to do, and on some occasions I've turned around and been like, have you spoken to a neurodiverse person about this? Because I could tell that it was not very, in my perspective, the best approach, and they were like, no, but from research. And I'm like, research is wonderful, research is great, but the best way you can learn something is talking to a person that is actually affected by the issue, and not reading it from a book or reading it from a text or research. Also, you've got to remember, research can be dated. Research can, something that's been researched 10 years ago might not be the same today. And I think that's the main thing. And then, I've emphasized a lot about making policies more inclusive, like what you said there as well, and, looking into that and that. But I think all of it is, as well, representation. Young people need to be represented a lot better, and there needs to be more young people in the rooms when these decisions about policies, when the decisions about platforms, when the decisions about all things considered online are being talked about, because we are the generation that has grown up mostly in technology and mostly in this world. And I always think it's so funny when I go to events sometimes, and it's I talk to people about it, and they tell me, oh yeah, we talked to young people about it, and I'm like, how many? And they're like, we have one person from each country or something like that, or one person from so I'm like in countries, for me, I'm from Ireland, and I'm like, see, one person in a whole country can represent how everybody in that country feels. Not a hope, And I think that's something that, because not that young person also doesn't hasn't been affected by every issue that that young people face within that country. And I think that's something that is big with collaborativeness as well. We need a collaborativeness with young people, and we need a diverse group of young people, and we need as many as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. I was actually looking at our next key respondent, Janine, because Janine, I saw you shaking your head vigorously as Molly was saying research isn't everything, which is quite interesting because you're a social anthropologist with a PhD on youth participation. So yeah, I mean, the mics, I want to give you the mic to you because I'm curious then what kind of key ingredients do you feel are important in ensuring future solutions that are impactful and also sustainable in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just very happy that I get to follow what Molly has to say. And I'm coming in speaking as a policy advisor for EDRi, but also as a social anthropologist. And I think what is important is to actually take into account the actual lived experiences of those whose interests are at the center of these debates. And that includes children and young people. Because, of course, as we witnessed today, like with what Molly and Yasin were saying, they are more than capable of articulating their needs and their concerns. And it's just a matter of bringing their insights into the process itself, into the design process itself, because otherwise we would always fall into this trap of brokenness simply because we failed to listen to what young people has to say. And this is also something that we try to forward in our submission to the call for evidence and the protection of minors. Like as EDRi, we highlight that the protection of minors should be on the basis of empowerment and not exclusion, which brings us to the point that we should have this due respect for the autonomy and agency of young people and also children and their parents and their guardians in order for them to be able to make those choices that serve their best interests instead of leaving it to the hands of big tech, who we know by now are very harmful. And so it's so also one of the things that we want to highlight is that for us to not like fall into this one-size-fits-all solution and the silver bullet, like for instance, age verification or parental controls, because, you know, as we try to bring forward, online safety should be a case of making everything, like a more holistically looking at it as like safety should be not just for minors, but for all, because God knows, as what we were talking about today, we would all want profiling to be turned off by default. So, and not just for minors. But I think what is even more important is to speak to what Molly was saying. Like, we should look at solutions not just from the perspective of experts, but also through a constant discussion with affected communities like children and young people, which is also something we try to advocate in our project, The Future Internet, in trying to come up with proactive approaches to addressing online harms. And I'm now speaking as a social anthropologist, at the end of the day, people are the experts of their own lived experiences. And I think this is what people-centered policymaking really truly means.
Yeah, thank you. So I see we're running out of time, but I do want to give the final word to you, Yasin. I know you've also already spoken a lot about creating equitable spaces, but you also touched upon the systemic solutions that need to be made. Could you elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts around that?
Sure. I mean, we all heard a lot of words now, the keywords like such as collaboration, civil organizations, stuff like that. For me personally, civil organization tickles me because also civil organizations comes in degrees and privileges. For example, the way frontline decision maker or policy writer or whatever, when they reach out to civil organizations, they are not reaching out to the grassroots of that civil organization and that community. And I think for me, it is an issue, although like it's been promoted or it's encouraged, but for me, I'm always like, to fix the systemic issues, to go to people who are oppressed by that systemic issue and not people who are representing people who are in that systemic issue, if that makes sense. Because I tend to see a lot from an anti-racism lens, and in Europe specifically, like a lot of migrant organizations are led fully by white folks. So you are reaching out a civil organization that is a migrant organization, yet there is not one single person with a single experience of being a migrant. So it doesn't make sense, but on paper it makes a lot of sense and good reporting that we collaborated with this organization that is working with migrants, but where are the migrants? Another thing that also I want to acknowledge is, for example, specifically for queer and racialized communities, as I said it before, we are taking baby steps. So if frontliners, whether governmental or not, they are interested and hold the value of making these spaces equitable for us, they need to reach us out instead of us always having to step in and like, hey, we're being discriminated and so on, in a way that is where they are willing to work with us and not work for us on our behalf. And yeah, especially when, as I mentioned, especially when talking about migrants and refugees, because for example, again, which is something that I really want to say again, the new pact on migration that was passed by the European Parliament, that is something that is getting no to little attention at all from even civil organizations. And that is something that was passed on April 10th, and it's not as loud as it should be. And I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. Also, one thing that that you mentioned, it was open spaces on conversations, and also that you mentioned in disclaimer in the beginning that open spaces are not supposed to be comfortable. They are supposed to be very uncomfortable because they're full of issues, and they're supposed to be led by the communities, as you both mentioned. And yeah, by communities, and not only civil organizations, because that is also very token, and people are getting salaries and getting money on behalf of people's struggle without even perpetrating those struggles the way they need to be perpetrated, especially when it comes to queers and racialized folks specifically.
Yeah, I hear you, by communities, yeah, for sure. I do want to give the floor to a final key responder, or Shaya, from Civil Liberties Union for Europe. Just a final key takeaway or key reflection on solutions. What is that? What is the, if you could give everyone one solution to think or ponder around from your own work that you feel could help build a better internet, what would it be? No pressure. But having heard the whole discussion, is there one thing that struck you? Let's put it that way.
Well, I think I'm not going to be surprising when I say that I don't know of any one solution that we all have and make this world to be a dream place for all of us. If I can have a wish, then my wish is that the Commission have, for the next few years, a real commitment to enforce the DSA. Because, well, we have seen what happens when not everyone is very well committed to enforcing some regulation, like GDPR. I would have to remind you of that. Enforcement goes with strict hands, and not only on Commission level, of course, but also on national level. And I think our role here in this room, and most of us are civil society, is to push the authorities so that it happens.
Yeah, thank you.
Not very interesting, I know.
No, for sure. Thank you. Our time is unfortunately running out. And again, here, I keep finding myself apologizing to everyone, because now I have to apologize to the audience because we don't have any time to get your questions. That said, I do encourage you to look for each other, seek each other out during the lunch and the other sessions if you have any questions. This is more a start of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation. But I would like to also thank our respondents, the panelists. Your rich contributions have really been much appreciated. And I hope that while we all have touched up throughout the rest of the day, but also perhaps outside of the summit itself. On that note, just more logistically, the next section will be starting in now. So please head over to the Pollack room if you're interested in the panel, Breaking Open Big Tech, A Vision for a Fair Digital Economy, or you can be here, remain seated for the roundtable on making EU laws work for people. Thank you, everyone.